Hello, and welcome to Literacy Matters. I'm your host, Dr. Cheryl Lundy Swift. I am super excited to have two guests today. You got two for one. Our guests are Amanda Morin and Emily Kircher-Morris, and I'm so excited to just have this conversation with them. Amanda Morin is a neurodivergent neurodiversity activist, early childhood specialist, and a nationally known speaker who is deeply committed to fostering accessible and inclusive environments for neurodivergent individuals. She leverages her expertise in learning and child development, universal design for learning, special education, advocacy, and mental health to distill complex data into easily digestible information for parents, educators, and employers who want to advance the mission of creating inclusive content, programs, and strategies to make the world accessible to all. She is the author of 6 books, including her latest, Neurodiversity Affirming Schools, Transforming Practices so all students feel accepted and supported, and she co-authored that with Emily Kircher-Morris, who is a mental health professional author and passionate advocate for neurodivergent learners. Now, as a twice exceptional student herself, she brings both lived experience and professional expertise to her work, supporting neurodivergent children, teens, and the adults who care for them. Emily hosts the popular Neurodiversity podcast. She speaks internationally and provides professional development that helps educators create more affirming, inclusive learning environments. So I want to welcome you to the show, Amanda and Emily.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
It's great. So again, I want to thank you for that book because my team and I actually used that book to develop an EdWeb that's entitled 5 Differentiation Strategies for Neurodivergent Learners. And it has gotten a lot of great feedback. And Amanda, I want to thank you personally because you reviewed that deck for us and it made the offering so much more stronger just to have your eye on it.
You're really welcome, and I appreciate you taking all the feedback because I am not an easy reviewer, so I appreciate you being receptive to all of that too.
Oh yeah, we were totally receptive to all of that. So, that title of your book includes the phrase neurodiversity affirming. What does that mean to you, and how is it different from simply being inclusive?
So I think that when Amanda and I were talking about this and trying to determine specifically what we wanted to, how we wanted to frame this, we specifically chose the term neurodiversity affirming. And essentially what this means is recognizing that people who are neurodivergent, although they may have different neurotypes, they are not broken. They don't just need to be fixed. And we don't need to try to make them look as though they are not who they are. And so the affirming piece is about the authenticity that comes along with welcoming students into our schools, into our classrooms, in a way that honors who they are. And Amanda, I'll let you kind of talk about maybe how you would compare that with the idea of simply being inclusive.
Sure. And I think even just the phrase itself is inclusive, right? We chose neurodiversity as opposed to neurodivergent affirming because neurodiversity encompasses all of the minds in your classroom, right? It's not just the neurodivergent learners. And we wanted to make sure we were talking about that. For me, when I think about the word inclusive, I think about the fact that you can't have inclusion without exclusion, right? Because when you're including people, somebody is making the decision about who's including them, right? Somebody's making a decision about who would normally be excluded in order to make it more inclusive. So I see a bit of a difference there in that we are just affirming all of the people who are in the classrooms, all of the students, instead of making decisions about who belongs or doesn't belong in typical situations, general education classrooms, schools, that kind of a thing.
I've never really thought about it that way. That is so enlightening, and it makes so much sense that when you're thinking about being inclusive, that means you're thinking about who's not included.
Right. Like inclusion wouldn't exist without exclusion, right?
Yeah.
So for me, it's starting, and Emily too. I know this. We've had we've had lots of conversation about this. It's about thinking about how do you start with who's there and then bringing in ways to make them all feel welcome and feel like they belong, as opposed to thinking about who might not be there and how do you accommodate for that.
Well, I Again, I love that response. That's so great. So, how do you actually define neurodivergence, especially when we're talking about learning to read and write?
Yeah. Well, when Amanda and I discussed this and we were talking about specifically how we wanted to frame neurodivergence within the context of this book, it was a conversation that we really had to discuss because there's not necessarily an agreed upon definition. It's kind of this term that has come out of the neurodiversity movement, and a lot of people have embraced it, but also it's not a formal diagnosis. It's not it's just this term that, so a lot of people lump different things into it. When we think about neurodivergence specifically, so we think about somebody typically who maybe qualifies for a label or an identification or a diagnosis that specifically would typically fall under like those neurodevelopmental labels. So autism, ADHD, but also specific learning disabilities. And when we think about what this means as far as neurology goes, each of those particular diagnoses have specific characteristics that you can see in the brain as far as how those brains are wired, how they activate, how they handle different tasks. We know, for example, students who are dyslexic, even when they are offered opportunities to learn in a multimodal fashion and kind of rebuild some of those neural pathways, it's not like you're fixing that brain. You are developing different ways that that brain is processing information that work for that person. But it's not like all of a sudden that person whose brain is wired that way is actually using the same parts of their brain as somebody who is not dyslexic. And so when we think about neurodivergence, we think about the fact that we really need to anticipate how kids are showing up in our classroom as far as how they process information. How do they learn? How do they communicate? All of these different components of this that are so important, and then work with their brains instead of against it.
Oh, yeah. What do you say, Amanda?
You know, Emily says it so beautifully, right? I think she really put together what I would have said, but I think the point about dyslexia and dyslexic students is really, really important because for a long time, we didn't think about specific learning disabilities under that umbrella of neurodivergent, right? And the fact is, and I nerd out a little bit on this, there are, functional MRI studies that show how that looks in the brain when students who have dyslexia, students who struggle to read, whether or not they have that label or identification, that there are parts of their brain that are not activating in the way we would expect them to. And so I think it's important to realize, like, this is real. This is real. And finding ways to work with their brain and activate those abilities to decode, the ability to understand, the ability to, read and comprehend and develop fluency and all of those kinds of skills. It's important to realize there's something going on in the brain. But it's not, that's not limited to students with dyslexia, right? There are students who are neurodivergent who have difficulty with executive function skills that also will impact reading and writing. And we have students who have difficulty with communication skills that's going to impact their ability to sort of understand the vocabulary and use it appropriately. So when we look at neurodivergent students, I think it's important to expand the idea that it's not just dyslexia that impacts writing and reading and things like that.
Sure. And what do you suggest that teachers do? Like, we know that teachers are becoming more and more fascinated with how the brain works, but how do they actually learn what the brain is doing for a variety of neurodivergent students? Like, so you have a student who is autistic or who has autism, you have a student who is dyslexic, or who is ADHD. How do they know what to do for those students?
It'd be so nice to say there's one answer, right? But there definitely isn't. And I think that's the first thing I would say to teachers is do not assume that because you know the diagnosis or the label or the identification that you know what to do for that student, right? And so that's that part of like feeling accepted, right? And supported is making sure that you understand the student who is in front of you instead of the diagnosis of the student in front of you, right?
Wow, well, that is powerful. Understand the student that is in front of you, not just the diagnosis that's in front. That is so key because it doesn't always show up the same way, right?
Well, and what I would add to that as well is that you will have students in your classroom who perhaps don't have a diagnosis. Like, let's say, hypothetically, you've got a student who is struggling in reading, and let's say they go through an entire assessment process. Well, just because maybe they don't quite meet identification criteria, maybe they don't quite reach that threshold, does that mean that they're not struggling? Does that mean that they don't need supports? And that's the same with all of these other pieces too, that it's very, a label or an identification is one very rudimentary tool that we use to try to group students to think about the strategies that we can use it's almost like a shorthand, or like maybe this is like the place to start first to try these types of things. But recognizing that it is just going to look so different. And so when we talk about learner variability, recognizing that that's every learner in your classroom, regardless of whatever label they may or may not have.
Yeah, that's great. So when it comes to reading in particular, what's something about neurodivergent students that you think educators often overlook?
I think one of the things that gets overlooked is less about the student and more about the process of reading, to be really frank. I think the process of reading is much more complicated than we think about. If you are somebody who didn't struggle learning to read, or you didn't struggle with any of the components of reading, it doesn't seem that complex because you just get it, right?
Right.
But there are so many things that go into reading that means there are so many places that process can break down. And I think that's less about the students and more about understanding, how do students learn how to read? How do they make sense of the information that comes in? How are they connecting it to prior knowledge? How are they attending to what's in front of them? How are they engaged by the content, right? I could go on and on and on. But I think what I would say is that it's really looking at the student and where are they having difficulty in that process. And so for teachers to think about what all goes into reading, and actually in the book we break down an example of what it looks like to read and how much you actually need to know to be able to read. It's more than decoding, it's more than fluency, it's more than understanding the quirks of the English language, because the English language has quirks, right, when you're looking at it. But I think it's knowing that comprehension is much more than just understanding the words on the page. It's understanding, how does it connect to other things? What is it that we're asking students to do when we want them to like break down a passage and give us themes and things like that. So for me, it's less about the neurodivergent student, and it's more about understanding where's that process breaking down, because it may not be just a neurodivergent student for whom that process is breaking down.
That is so important. I mean, it's really, again, it's knowing your students, but also knowing how people learn to read.
Yeah.
And being able to like pinpoint, this is where this is breaking down for this student. And as you said, they may not be neurodivergent. Right. So that's really awesome. Now, I hear a lot that people sometimes leverage audiobooks to support children's comprehension. What do you think about it? I've heard people saying, well, that's not really reading. What do you think about that?
It's funny, actually. I don't remember, Amanda, if I talked about this on the podcast at one of the episodes that we did with my sister. Have you heard me talk?
I don't know.
Okay.
I heard the story, but I haven't heard
So my sister and I, this was around the holidays, and we were having a conversation. She's a kindergarten teacher specifically. And so, and she loves reading and literacy. Like, that's really, her area of passion. Anyway, we were having a conversation and talking about reading books. And I had set a goal for myself last year to read a certain number of books, and was going to track it on Goodreads so I could see how many books, if I'd reached my goal or whatever. And I had. So anyway, I was kind of talking to her about that. And she said, well, what books did you read? So I started kind of going through and listing the books that I had read. And I said, and this one was an audiobook and that one was an audiobook. And she goes, wait a second, do you count audiobooks as reading? I said, do you not count audiobooks as reading? And, when we broke it down, really what it is she's coming to it from that viewpoint of a kindergarten educator who is teaching phonics, who is teaching students how to process phonological concepts and sound out words in order to then put those words together and gain meaning. Right. When I am reading a book as an adult, I am reading it for comprehension. And whether I listen to it or read it with my eyes, it doesn't matter. The process mentally is the same.
Right.
So when we think about this really gets back to one of those foundational principles of universal design for learning, which is when you're looking to make an accommodation, when you're looking to provide a support, the question that you need to ask is, what is the goal of that learning? If the goal of the learning is to be able to sound out certain letters and you know, blends and all these different things, then obviously an audiobook is not going to accomplish that goal.
Right.
If the goal of the lesson is to comprehend the concepts or to be able to pull the main ideas or whatever it might be, why not an audiobook? If that reduces a barrier and helps you actually get at what you're trying to measure with that student.
Yeah.
You know, I'll tell you what, Emily, you know what, it made me think about, we have a program called Phonics Reading and Me, and it made me think about how we use that program, because obviously kids can read text on the screen. And for those kids who may get to a word or that they cannot decode, they can click on that word and hear it and see it and put those two together. So to me, I think even for younger learners, there's a way to kind of marry even that listening to helping children be able to decode. So I think that's a really great thing. What a great discussion.
I will also say too that you know, from a neuroscience perspective, and I think this matters to educators because sometimes we have to make the case for things, right? And so from a neuroscience perspective, audiobooks activate the same language center in your brain as visual reading. And that's just a really good point to be able to know and make. Also, David Flink, who is another neurodiversity activist, talks about it as ear reading, which I think is a really nice way of putting that.
Reading.
Ear reading.
I love that. So, you know, we talked about reading being this kind of complex task and being able to understand where students kind of break down, that you have to know, you know, what the process is. But you know what? Writing is even more complex, I believe, than that. How do you think things like sensory processing or executive functioning impact neurodivergent students as writers?
Where to even start, I think. You know, I mean, one of the things that comes to mind immediately is just the idea of, first of all, getting started. So that task initiation component of things, being able to organize thoughts. We think about executive function as like difficulty with organization. It also means organization of thoughts, right? So when we have students who are trying to write, that sometimes they can tell you a fantastic story, but they're not going to write the same story down, because organizing it and then getting it on paper and keeping thematically can be difficult. I also think I've seen as a teacher, you know, in my classroom, and I taught young kids for a very long time, I've seen a lot of students who struggle to write because of sensory processing, because they can't tell how hard they're pressing down on the paper. They can't tell if they're holding the pencil too tight. They'll rip through the paper because they really just are having difficulty with sensing how their grasp is. And that can be very frustrating for our students. And it turns them off writing because they feel like they're not doing it well, right? So, I mean, that's just a couple of ways that come to mind. Emily, what would you add to that?
Yesterday, I was actually on a consultation call where I develop an assessment plan with a family, and they were talking about their child who had a previous ADHD diagnosis. They're wanting to know if something else is going on. They're concerned about dysgraphia. And as we're talking through this, I realized that we were also going to need to screen for autism, because one of the things that I really see is one of the primary components of autism is communication, social communication. And so that is another thing that can then influence the writing. I find that, you know, a lot of kids really struggle with writing things that are ambiguous. You know, you would think, write a paragraph about what your weekend was like. You would think that that's super easy. There's no right or wrong answer, whatever. But for some kids, especially those kids who struggle with social communication, who struggle with identifying and labeling their emotions, like those are really almost impossible tasks. And then you layer on top of it the executive functioning difficulties like Amanda was talking about, where you have to plan and prioritize specifically what you want to say and what the order is in which you want to say it.
Yeah.
And then and I would say also layering on top of that, this fear of not getting it right for some of those kids who are very black and white thinkers. Like there's so many pieces that feed into this. But the problem is for so many of our neurodivergent kids, what that looks like in the classroom when you are observing it is a kid who doesn't want to get started. They're lazy, they're unmotivated, they won't try. And it becomes often interpreted like a disciplinary or a compliance issue, as opposed to recognizing all of those multiple layers that go into the task of writing a paragraph about your weekend.
So how do teachers, how do they address it? So again, thinking about those teachers out there who are like, yes, I have students just like that are that maybe are slow starters, that I can't seem to get to do that very, what I call a simple task, using my air quotes here. Right? What can they do to help those neurodivergent students?
I think it goes back to what Emily was saying about the goal. What is the goal of the assignment, right? So first of all, do you have to write about your weekend? Or are you just looking to see if a student can write you a paragraph? Can they choose their own prompt? Is there something they can tell you about in their own way? And will that give you the opportunity to evaluate the skills you're looking at, right? So first of all, rethinking what your goal is, or really narrowing in on the goal, because maybe the prompt will change the output to some degree. I think giving students the option to do text to speech if it's not about the handwriting, right? Or I'm sorry, I said that backwards, speech to text, right? Giving them the opportunity to use different ways of putting the writing down is an important thing to think about. And I also think just understanding that if your goal isn't to see how much they can write in a certain amount of time, maybe it's okay to say, take your time. Here's a graphic organizer. Let's organize your thoughts. Let's give you something to like as a rubric or an exemplar to look through and to figure out how you're going to do this. I had a great conversation with a teacher at one point. I was trying to figure out like how to talk about like giving kids, and I'm using my air quotes, cheat sheets. And she was like, no, I call those handy helpers. And I have used that from now on because it's not a cheat sheet. It's a handy helper, right? So giving those handy helpers and other ways of beginning that writing process is something that is really easy to implement in the classroom, right? So it's not revamping your entire curriculum. It's a matter of thinking through, what do I need from this student? And are there other ways I can get that information?
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to also add, I know it sounds complicated and it sounds really overwhelming because there are so many factors to it, but I do think it's also important to realize that when a student shows up in your classroom, they're carrying with them all of those experiences from past years. And so what are the internalized messages that they've experienced from previous classrooms where they were told, well, you're not trying, you just need to get, do all these things. Like there is also, for a lot of students who have been in educational settings that don't meet them where they are, a lot of internalized ableism, a lot of trauma that has to be undone. And I don't want to make it sound harder than it is, but I am validating the fact that it is hard, and recognizing, like, for teachers who feel like, gosh, I've tried all of these things, I would say just back up, go slow, find one little piece of success that student can have and build on that and build that rapport and that trust so that they know that they're not going to be getting in trouble or feeling like having to take work home for homework that nobody else has to take home just because it takes them longer or whatever it might be.
One of the blessings of doing this podcast is when I'm talking to my guests, it always makes me think of myself as a student, as a teacher, and as a school leader. And you just made me think of a young man that I call him the student who taught me the most about teaching. And he could never get started writing right away until I got to know him better and just found out what was all the trauma that was happening from his past experience in school and at home. But one of the things that he loved to talk about and eventually I learned to write about was fishing. And so other kids were writing about whatever the topic may have been, maybe something that we have read, and he would look at me and I would figure out a way to make it about fishing. And then eventually we would make a deal that I'd say, okay, so we can do fishing on this one. For the next one, can we do, and guess what? Amanda, I was looking for the skill. Can you write a cohesive paragraph? Are you using the vocabulary? And he would. So I do think sometimes it's letting go as a teacher as to what you think it should look like in terms of the goal. What is the goal? If the goal is to write a complete sentence, that complete sentence can be about something that students are interested in, not just the prompt that you came up with.
And as a teacher, letting go is hard. I mean, I'm just going to say that flat out. Letting go is hard because
Yes.
we also feel like we are being judged on our ways of doing things, right? And
Right.
it is hard to feel like maybe you're not showing up in a way somebody else would expect you to, which is very relatable because it's the same thing that some of our students are worried about. So I think like
Yeah.
there's a connection there. But part of what you're describing is you developed a relationship with that student, right? So that mattered just as much as you understanding like what your goal was, because he was willing to do the next thing without talking about fishing because he trusted you. And that's just, that goes to all of the things that we're talking about, is how much that relationship matters as well.
Yeah, so true. One last thing that I wanted to point out, because you mentioned this at the beginning of your response, Amanda, you mentioned sensory processing, that some students don't know, how, if they're holding it too tight or whatever. And I want you to know, I was one of those students as well. And I had to have my grip changed because I was writing and holding it so hard and ripping through paper myself. So I want teachers to know that observe your students. If they're, if they're rubbing their hand or shaking their hand out, if you're noticing again that they're ripping through paper or it's too light or too dark, they might actually be attributing writing with pain. And we can, you can teach children again how to modify their grip. You can support them and better understanding in some cases how hard they're writing. And there are lots of things that we can do. And we help teachers and occupational therapists like that
Yeah.
with our Handwriting Without Tears program. So that's something you can certainly do. So I want to just mention that because I thought that was important for you to mention. So, we talked about handwriting, obviously, but there's technology out there. We're full of technology. And I want you to tell me, have you seen technology like keyboarding serve as like a turning point in unlocking students' literacy skills
Oh,
at
I mean,
all?
absolutely. I actually was working with a student yesterday. I have a teenager that I was working with who was just struggling, had this page and page of comprehension questions to go with something they had done in a class, and just was like, nope, I can't do this. And I was like, well, what if we put it in Google Docs? And he was like, all right, what do you mean? What if we put it in Google Docs? I was like, well, do you know the answers to the questions? And he was like, I do. I just can't write them all out. So he sat down and he just like typed it out in Google Docs, had the answers, did the writing, right? And it took him like no time. And the feeling of accomplishment was like really clear on his face. And like for a teenager to show like a feeling of accomplishment, if you've ever met a teenager, that's an impressive thing to like show that, yeah, I'm proud of myself, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, I think there are definitely ways that technology is playing a role in how we can support our students. And that's just one that comes to mind for me.
Sure. I think that's great. We have a keyboarding program called Keyboarding Without Tears. And, I think like reading and writing, you guys have mentioned that we need to understand the processes and how they actually learn to do it. We assume because our kids are born with devices in their hands that they know how to use them and how to use them well, right? Because they do know how to use them. We ask them, hey, how do you do this? And they can show us. But in terms of actually learning to type efficiently, that's why it's important to teach them also in a more explicit way using something like Keyboarding Without Tears. And we are doing such great work in making Keyboarding Without Tears more accessible, making sure that, all students, again, every single student can actually leverage our Keyboarding Without Tears program, even children who are typing with only one hand, which is great. I'd love to shift a little bit, and because I know that families are listen to this podcast as well, and I want you to know that being a parent of a neurodivergent child can be challenging. And one of the biggest challenges I think that I keep hearing from families is how to actually navigate schools. So what's one piece of advice you might give to parents to help empower them and having tough conversations with their teachers or school leaders?
I mean, wow. I mean, I don't think I have one piece, but I would say, I come at this as a teacher and a parent to neurodivergent children. So I've been in both of those roles. And I often try to be really careful about how I say that, because a lot of people say I've been on both sides of the table. And I think it's important not to say both sides of the table, because it puts us in an us versus them position. And for me, that's one of the pieces of advice that I often give to families, is to think about this as not an us versus them, but as a team that is trying to support your child, right? And so for some parents, that's a mindset shift, because, and I'm going to, really honestly, because many of us have had challenges in school systems. And I would say to keep in mind, it's the systems that you're having challenges with, right? Because if you can develop a relationship with at least one teacher or one person at a school who you can really talk to about your child and about what they need and how they could be supported, then you're breaking through that systems piece of it, right? The challenges are with how do you navigate a system that isn't necessarily set up for neurodivergent students, isn't set up for family engagement, but finding that way in to making sure you have somebody who you can talk to and feel comfortable with is the first piece of advice I would give. The second is, I think every single conference table that we talk about students should be round. I don't think there should be like rectangular tables anymore. They should all be round so we don't have sides of tables. But, I think just acknowledging that it's hard. And I think being able to say that to somebody at a school is really a vulnerable position to be in, because you don't want to admit as a parent that you're struggling, right? You don't want to be able to say, like, if I could have fixed this already, I would have fixed this already, whatever fix means in this situation. And I think that goes back to being able to say to people, we're not looking to fix my child. We're looking to understand my child. We're looking to support my child.
I think it's interesting, having been a teacher, a school counselor, and also a parent to neurodivergent kids, and being neurodivergent myself, and having watched my mom advocate for me, I think it's important to just recognize how much of a systemic aspect there is to this. Because again, parents are coming in with their own experiences and their own emotions. And if they have a neurodivergent child, maybe they are also neurodivergent. And so what was their experience like in the schools, and how does that make them feel about coming to the schools? I mean, I've talked to folks who will talk about, going back to the school for their child is really uncomfortable for them because it brings up so much of their own experience that's unresolved. And so I think that something we can do as educators is really approach parents when we're talking about this as that collaborative mentality, where we are trying to brainstorm and find solutions, trying to offer suggestions, but doing it in a way that is approachable and welcoming, and for the parents too. I always say it's so much easier to advocate for other people's kids than my own kids. It's so much easier to go into an IEP meeting or a 504 meeting and, kind of like be somebody's champion that's not that I don't have any personal connection to. But it's much scarier to do that as a parent. I mean, I've had to do that, and it's hard because it's an ongoing relationship, and you don't want to damage that ongoing relationship by coming across too harshly. But at the same time, you need to make sure that they are hearing what you're saying as you try to support your kids. And so I think the other part of this is also just about the collaborative piece of involving kids in these conversations.
Yes.
And letting them have a voice, not having conversations about them if they're not involved. And I think that actually changes the dynamic quite a bit when we try to pull them into this process as well. And so parents can advocate for that. I don't want my child to be there for the whole meeting, but maybe part of it, or whatever that might look like for a situation. But involving kids is also a really important component of this, even at young ages.
Yeah. So true. So very true. Inviting children to the conversation affirms that they're people and they're human beings, and they understand their feelings, and they know more than we think they do. I love that. What are some of the key shifts you think, as a result of this, that you believe schools need to make in order for them to become truly neurodiversity affirming?
The first shift, I think, is just believing that they need to be neurodiversity affirming, right? I mean, that's a place to start. And I don't think we can assume that everybody's there yet. And that's fine, right? So I think knowing that you want to be neurodiversity affirming, knowing that there are going to be neurodivergent students in every classroom, period. Whether you know it or not, they are there. There are probably neurodivergent staff in your schools, whether you know it or not, and they are there and they will need you to be neurodiversity affirming as well. But I also think we just need to understand that special education systems are often designed around compliance, right? And so thinking through how are we using our systems, our 504 plans, our individualized education programs, how are we using those tools to really support students beyond compliance, right? How are we looking at their strength-based perspective? How are we looking at goals that support them being who they are and not teaching them to be more like a neuronormative student, right? How are we giving them opportunity to show up in more authentic ways, despite the fact that we also have benchmarks to meet and compliance standards and things like that? I think those are some systemic changes that I would really like to see. And I know that it's a big ask. It's a big ask, but it's a place I'd like to see a shift toward.
I think the only thing I would add to that too is while Amanda's talking about it is a big shift, but it's also a lot of small steps within that shift. And so it doesn't have to be done overnight. And so you start with conversations, you start with bringing people, into the process, as far as the staff goes. You talk about, implementing one little technique or strategy aligned with universal design for learning, like all of these little components that when they are accumulated make a big difference. And so it doesn't, even though it is overwhelming, when you look at it from the big picture, it doesn't have to feel overwhelming as far as the actionable steps that you take.
Sure. So can you share an example of a common school practice that in some ways might seem supportive on the surface, but actually is not affirming for neurodivergent students?
I'm going to say something and some people are probably going to be mad at me about it, but I'm going to say it in a gentle way and say, I get it. This is why you do this in your schools, but so many schools use PBIS. And the problem with PBIS strategies and processes is that they are very prescriptive and they do not take into account the needs of neurodivergent learners. And I think that is something. So when I think about neurodiversity affirming practices, I would say that most PBIS systems that I've seen in place in schools are not, we'll just say are not neurodiversity affirming. And part of it has to do with the extrinsic rewards that are given. Part of it has to do with the expectations that are given, like this is how you walk in the hallways, this is how you sit and listen, this is how you do this, how you do that. And for our neurodivergent kids who maybe aren't the ones who are earning the certificates, to go in the drawing, who maybe aren't the ones who really are able to just, who need more movement, who need more shifts, PBIS systems are based on neuronormative standards, and we really need to reckon with that and try to analyze what shifts might be done there.
That's a big part when I think about PBIS. I think about how do we know if we're not trying yet that a neurodivergent student is, quote unquote, at risk to have significant behavior. What is significant behavior in the first place?
That's right.
Right.
What are we interpreting as behavior?
Yeah.
Or is there, like when we were giving the examples about writing specifically and written expression, and we kind of went through this huge long list of all of those things that could be happening there. Are we working on resolving those things before we're saying, well, this student isn't following this particular expectation? Now, right. I will say one of the things about PBIS that I think is helpful, and I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but is that it does rely on pretty explicit instruction about what expectations are, which for many neurodivergent students actually is really helpful. But I think that there has to be another piece of that is also about recognizing that what we expect this to be for some kids might look different.
Indeed. And can you guys tell us what PBIS stands for?
Positive Behavior Intervention Systems.
Yep. For those folks that might call it something else. Absolutely. Yeah. It's so funny. When you were talking, Emily, it made me think about, I took on a principalship at a school, and their middle schoolers had to walk in a straight line, and they had to not talk. And I remember meeting with the students and saying, what's one thing that you want to change before I took on the principalship? And they were like, we don't want to walk in a straight line, and we need to talk. Like I get into trouble when I go into class because I got to get it out. I got to move. I got to, and I'm like, yeah. So guess what? We changed that. It's important for us to think about why we're doing what we're doing and what we're actually teaching children to do and know how to do. Walking in a straight line.
And I think it's important to think about whether or not it's something we would ask of ourselves, right? Do your teachers walk down the hallway in a straight line and not talk? Probably not. Probably not. I don't think I could do that. I know I couldn't do
Not
that.
all day.
Like,
No,
right?
you
Not
can
all
do it
day.
all day for sure.
Right. So if it's not something we would expect the adults in the school to do, is it reasonable to expect our students to do it too?
Yeah, yeah. Now, I want to ask you, if I can, with funding being reduced and the environment that we're in now, students are at risk of losing essential supports. How can we as a community step up to share the load? And what can educators do to continue meeting students' needs without burning them out?
I mean, I think in part that's what this entire shift in book is about, right? Is making sure that we're sharing the load across all educators, right? Making sure that we understand that students are ours, they're not mine and yours, right? That there are regular education and general education and special education, whatever you're going to call those classrooms, it's all students. Those are our students in the classroom, and making sure that they are supported, but also making sure that we are supporting our teachers in understanding the practices, giving them professional development, recognizing that this is a hard profession, like full stop, hard profession, and that the expectations on our teachers are high too. So I think just giving teachers a little bit of grace is important, but also knowing that neurodiversity affirming practice doesn't happen in just one classroom. It happens across schools. It happens across grade levels. It happens across all kinds of teachers.
Are there common classroom practices that unintentionally shut down or maybe discourage our neurodivergent students?
I think the easiest thing to say there is probably lack of flexibility, which can look like a lot of different things. When we are really caught up in every student has to do everything the exact same way, that is when we're going to put up roadblocks for our neurodivergent students, and they're not going to be able to meet our expectations nearly as easily as if we meet them where they are and scaffold that support and bring them along.
So, yeah, that's so important. So then with that said, how can neurodivergent individuals then advocate for themselves in the classroom or other settings for that matter?
I mean, that's a hard one to answer, right? And I mean, it's complicated to answer because if we don't have teachers who are ready to receive advocacy, are we setting students up in a safe environment to advocate for themselves, right? So I actually think the first thing we need to do is teach teachers to be more flexible, to have new ways to approach things, to be ready to hear when a student says, I need something different, and to be able to say, let's talk about what that can look like, right? I don't think it's, I mean, and this may be a little controversial to say, I don't think it's the responsibility of the neurodivergent individual to continually be the one who is asking for what they need. I think it is our responsibility as a society to understand that we, because I'm also neurodivergent, exist and will need different things. And, so yes, I think we should teach kids to speak up for themselves, but first we need to teach them it is safe to do so, that you're going to be heard when you speak up for yourself.
And the way I really talk about this when I'm working with educators and parents really is recognizing we ask kids to self-advocate. We ask them to say what they need. Sometimes they don't know what that is. But the other part of it is asking for help is really scary. It requires a level of vulnerability. And so if we are the people who are in the positions of power, we need to be opening the door for that advocacy to allow it to lower the threshold of anxiety and fear and overwhelm that goes along with just asking for that help. And so checking in with students, giving them processes in multiple ways that they can advocate, giving them options and just allowing them to choose. Like those are all things that can build that confidence so that they know what works for them and then they can advocate effectively.
Yeah, that's creating a safe space to be able to do it. Asking for help is truly, even as an adult who's asked for help all my life, it's still really hard to ask for help. So that's great. And we have to set those safe spaces for people to do that, because that
Yeah.
means also teachers too, right? That are neurodivergent. This has been such an enlightening conversation. I would love to end our conversation by asking you why you think literacy matters.
I mean, literacy matters because it's how we communicate, right? We communicate through all different kinds of literacy: emotional literacy, financial literacy, reading literacy, right? Those are the ways we communicate. And it matters to teach our students how they can communicate with ourselves, with us, others, with their parents, with their community.
I think the other reason that I think of when I think about why literacy matters is because it opens the doors to seeing experiences beyond what you've lived in so many ways. And for our neurodivergent students, that is so important because they may not fit really well in a lot of different environments, but having that ability to explore and hear from other people who have similar experiences, whether they're fictional or not, can be really, really empowering and life-changing, I think, for many neurodivergent learners.
It has been a pleasure, Amanda and Emily, to talk to you. How can people find you, find your work, and get in touch with you?
I mean, the easiest way to find the two of us together is at Neurodiversity-Affirming Schools.com. You can find all the work we do together. We're also on most of the social media platforms. You can find us there sometimes. I mean, I'm not going to say I'm there all the time. I'm there sporadically, but I would start with Neurodiversity-Affirming Schools.com.
Yeah. Sure. And the only thing I would add to that is Amanda and I released a limited series podcast that aligns with the book. You don't even have to have the copy of the book to appreciate it, but there's basically an episode that aligns with each chapter. And it is called the Creating Neurodiversity Affirming Schools podcast. And so you can look it up anywhere you listen to podcasts. And, that might be another great entry point to hear more about the things that we've been talking about today.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure. Have a great day, guys. Thanks for being on.
Thanks for having us.